Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, introducing the topic of immune competence, which is a component of resilience, and the new trait called ImmuneDEX breeding values, which has now been released onto the market. My name is Mel Dowling, and I'll be convening the session today. I've been with Neogen for about 6 years as the technical product specialist for sheep and goat products. So I'll just go through a little bit of housekeeping to start with. So down the left-hand side of your screen, you will see the slides and our guest panelists. In the middle, you have the panel video feed, and at the bottom of that is a Q&A box where you can type in questions. Please type them in as we're going through the presentation, and we'll try and answer those questions. Some of them we'll do while the presentation is going, and others we'll do at the end. We've got a very significant time at the end where we can get deep dive into some of those questions and answers. On the right, we have some additional resources there. There's a call to action button if you'd like Greg Sawyer, our sales specialist, to give you a call and talk through anything after the session. And also there's a button down there to a survey, which I'll prompt you closer towards the end, but we'd love to collect some answers from you in regards to this immune competent trait and how valuable it will be to you. So I'll start by just introducing our panel for the day. Just want to greatly acknowledge their time to come and provide some support and also to deep dive into some of the technical questions around immune competence. So first up, I'll hand over to Amy. Amy's from CSIRO and a sheep researcher, has been for some time. So I'll hand over to Amy just to give a quick 30-second snapshot of who she is and where she's been.
Thanks, Mel. I just wanted to thank Neogen for the opportunity to be part of this panel today. I think we're going to have a great chat, hopefully. So I've worked here at our research station, Chiswick, in northern New South Wales for nearly 30 years. And I guess I see my role as working out what research tools will be valuable for producers and working with teams like Neogen to actually bring those tools to life, using animals that we hope are commercially relevant. And yeah, I think I started off mainly in parasitology, but my whole career I've just been around that genetic space. So you're really seeing my role as helping develop those tools that actually help producers produce the best animals they possibly can.
Perfect, thank you, Amy. And next we have Aaron Ingham from CSIRO also. So he has been part of the lead team for a lot of the influential research to improve animal health and welfare on the cattle side. So Aaron, would you like to just say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. So Aaron Ingham, I'm a researcher with CSIRO. I'm in the Ag and Food Business Unit based in Brisbane. I've been with CSIRO for 30 years, this is my 30th year. Started at the Australian Animal Health Lab in Geelong, obviously where we were dealing with a lot of work around vaccine development. And since moving to Brisbane have been much more around developing new traits for cattle, and so the immune competence trait as an example of that. So, thanks, Mel.
Perfect, thank you, Aaron. And finally, but definitely not least, Brad Hine from Angus Australia. He is the Development and Adoption of Genetics Tools Officer there. So Brad, I'll hand over to you for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Mel, and thanks, Neogen, for the opportunity to talk to everyone today. So, yeah, my name's Brad Hine. I'm an Extension Officer with Angus Australia. Pretty new to that role with Angus, only started in October last year. Prior to that, I worked as a research scientist with CSIRO and worked with Aaron and Amy and the team on the development of ImmuneDEX. And I guess my research focus has largely been around animal health and with a particular interest in resilience-based traits that can help producers breed animals that are both productive and resilient.
Great, thank you, Brad. And I guess probably just important to note that we do have a bit of a cattle team sitting there today to answer questions. And the reason why that is because immune competence has actually been released out into the cattle space for a few years now. And so I think there's some really valuable learnings that we can take from the cattle industry. So that's why we've got them on the panel today. And I might just skip in now and we'll start talking about ImmuneDEX in merinos. What we're really talking about here is the next phase of genetic gain in the sheep industry. We've done a very incredible job of selecting for production, but now we're operating in much more challenging environments. And the next step isn't just more production, but it's animals that can cope, recover and perform under pressure and drive higher profits. Neogen has over a decade of research and industry partnership that we build into every tool that we do here at Neogen. We really care about the sheep industry and we're really focused on giving back and building a better industry. Through these relationships, we've built a collaborative project which is co-funded by the MLA donor company with CSIRO, AgBoo and Sheep Genetics. And that's been about translating immune competence research into this practical on-farm selection tool called ImmuneDEX. We recognise the important research that was conducted by CSIRO and AWI, understand the economic impact that this would have on farm and the value it would bring to industry. And so in a very short period of time, Neogen's been able to bring ImmuneDEX to market because we recognise the magnitude of importance of this trait. And so we're really excited to be able to bring that to market as quick as what we have. So let's step back and examine the concept of a resilient sheep. In tough times, you require tougher animals out there on farm, and having more resilient animals helps safeguard you from a number of things, like environmental extremes that increase stress and disease risk for the animals, including prolonged droughts, intense rainfall events, increased stress from emerging and re-emerging diseases, increasing costs for labour and supplementary feeding, which narrow profit margins, and overlaying these challenges is an increasing focus on animal welfare and sustainability driven by our market and community expectations. So resilience really is defined as the ability of an animal to maintain productivity in the face of stress, and is therefore becoming a very critical trait to consider in our breeding objective. Immune competence is a key biological component of resilience, and it influences how effectively the animal responds to disease and recovers from challenges. So if we dig a little bit deeper into what an immune competent sheep might look like, I've brainstormed some really just different terms that I've heard producers use to describe a resilient or an immune competent sheep. Things like sheep being fit for purpose, it's easy care, a doable sheep, something that's really hardy. And there's many more words up there on the slide that just describe what this immune competence trait will be able to help us with on farm. And it's exciting that we can actually now quantify this into a measurable trait. Will immune competence have an impact, an economic impact? Yes, it absolutely will. Disease remains one of our biggest profit drains in the sheep industry, costing around $1.5 billion annually. But the real insight isn't just on how big that number is, it's actually where the cost sits. And so among the top 5 contributors are internal parasites, weaner ill thrift and mortality, and fly strike. These costs are significant for merino producers where survival, growth, and welfare strongly affect enterprise profitability. Immune competence has been used in the cattle industry for several years now, and we can look and learn from what they've discovered. And CSIRO have done some research looking at the economic divide between different immune competent groups. They split some feedlot cattle into high, average and low immune competence values, and then looked at the health cost per head. And the key message from that is that 12% of animals fell into that bottom immune competent group, and that accounted for over a third of the total health costs. So in a very small proportion of animals are driving a disproportionate amount of cost. And it isn't about just like breeding the best animals, it's about identifying and removing the worst animals. So what if we had one simple solution to improve all of these diseases and improve overall health in flocks? ImmuneDEX is a genomic breeding value that measures immune competence, that is the animal's ability to respond to disease and stress. Targets the root cause, offering a solution to multiple health issues simultaneously. Gives us the opportunity to remove poor performers and lift average productivity of the flock. And because it's a genomic solution, we can capitalise on all of the best parts of genomics, which can inform early decisions, create long-term genetic change, and give you the most information from one wise investment. So let's briefly break down what actual ImmuneDEX measurement is. And I might call on Amy here because she's the expert. But basically it combines two parts of the immune system into a single value. And there's two responses to a vaccine. So Amy, I might just throw over to you to just quickly describe those two different components of the immune system that's contributing to this ImmuneDEX response.
Sure. Thanks, Mel. So I think one of the most important aspects of ImmuneDEX is that when the trait was being developed years ago now and refined, it was important to have a measurement that didn't preclude the animals from being available for sale and to do any of their normal activities that they were involved in. So we used just a normal commercially available clostridial vaccine. And as Mel mentioned, there's two components of the animal's response that we measure. One is what we call the antibody-mediated immune response. So that's one that's more tied to things like responding to internal parasites. So for the antibody-mediated immune response, we take a blood sample. Usually the animals have a primary vaccination at around marking time, and then they have their secondary vaccination around weaning time a few weeks later. So we come in about 2 weeks after that secondary vaccination and take a blood sample, and then we do a lab test just to have a look at the circulating antibody in terms of the response to the tetanus fraction of that clostridial vaccine. The other part that we look at, that we do as part of the weaning process, because as Mel mentioned, it's important to do this when the animals are under stress. We want to find those animals that do the best when we know they're going through a reasonably stressful time, because they're the ones that we want to have going forward for our breeding purposes. So the cell-mediated immune response, we actually inject a small amount of that very same clostridial vaccine under the skin, and these are more to do with the viral responses and other pathogens that are involved in immune responses. And we basically measure the size of the lump 48 hours later. The bigger the lump, the bigger the cell-mediated immune response has been. And then we combine those two parts of the immune responses together, and we come up with an overall immune response, our combined immune response, which is that ImmuneDEX phenotype that we're talking about today.
Perfect, thanks Amy. And so what I think is important to take away from that is immune competence is a really important, really technical kind of trait to measure phenotypically on farm. And so you can liken it to, say, eating quality in meat. It's really hard to measure that trait as well. And so we can use the power of genomics there to be able to give us some concrete measurements to be able to select in our flock. So the key point I think from that is it's not measuring whether the animal gets sick, It's actually measuring how well it responds when it's challenged. So CSIRO, with the help of AWI funding, have conducted immune competence measurements on over 5,000 MLP flock animals. And these animals have also received a full gamut of production measurements as well. And the exciting news for immune competence is that there's significant variation that exists within the population, meaning there's the ability to select those really high performers and make genetic gain. And also the trait is moderate to highly heritable, meaning that we can make some really solid, fast genetic progress here. We have ImmuneDEX, and so we can use that measurement to make real genetic progress. So just a little reminder as well, that Q&A chat that's down the bottom in the middle of your screen there, to pop any questions you might have in there as we're going along. So what does a high ImmuneDEX sheep do? It stays productive under challenges, which translates, it recovers faster when exposed to disease and stress. It needs less intervention on farm. And all this means fewer costs, fewer losses, and more consistent performance of your sheep across seasons. Importantly, one of the things that we found is it's not coming at the expense of production traits. The relationships with some of our key production traits are low to neutral and are favourable with disease traits. So it isn't replacing, I should say, you know, we've got very favourable relationships with post-weaning weight and also with WEC and DAG. And this measurement is not actually replacing WEC and DAG, it's actually another tool in the toolbox that you can use to help select and strengthen your breeding objective there. So how do you access ImmuneDEX? From a practical point of view, it's accessed through your existing genomic testing. That's part of our existing workflow with Smart Flock Elite. It's available on all merino orders from the 1st of May, and the first release of results will be in July this year. This test is exclusive to Neogen, and it's only available for those Smart Flock Elite orders. No extra cost, which I think is a really, really big advantage. There is a new submission form that's been live on the Sheep DNA website for a few months now, but it has a breed column that must be completed to be able to get these results. So you'll notice this is our existing form, and we've just included a breed column there. You need to make sure that you're popping merino into that column to ensure that you'll get these immune competence results. So how do we interpret these ImmuneDEX results? So ImmuneDEX is a true breeding value. It's not within flock. It means that we can compare animals across flocks. A higher ImmuneDEX value indicates a stronger immune response, and a lower value indicates a more vulnerable animal. We're also going to present an ImmuneDEX rank on the results. So an animal with a rank of 1 will be in the top 10th percentile of the genomic reference population for immune competence, and an animal with a rank of 10 will be in the bottom 90th percentile. So this is to give you a little bit of a feel to understand the potential selection opportunity that you have. So say, for example, you come in at a rank of 5, you're in the middle of that reference population, means there are a lot more sires out there that can improve your position against that reference population. And the key thing to remember is that those biggest gains can come from identifying and removing those lowest performers. So the key messages to take away from today's session is that it's a small number of animals that are driving disease costs. Using ImmuneDEX will lift profitability and remove risk. Don't chase the top, remove the bottom end and use alongside your existing production traits. I'm really proud to say that, you know, I work for Neogen, and it's a company that's been really committed to research and supporting the Australian sheep industry and bringing innovation and real solutions. And what we've talked about here is an opportunity, understanding where the costs sit and how ImmuneDEX can help identify and remove those lower performing animals. So what I'd like to do now is just unpack that in some more detail, the science behind it, what the research is telling us and how we can apply it in our breeding programs. And so we're going to flip to our Q&A panel here to start to dig really deeply into some of these things. And so make sure that you pop those questions down into the Q&A box, anything that you want to know on this subject, and we'll endeavour to answer those questions. So first up, maybe just to set the scene, Amy, can you unpack a little bit more about what resilience is and how immune competence fits into that?
Sure, Mel, and Mel certainly did a great job of outlining what resilience was early on in the webinar. But I'll just take one little step back and just to sort of paint the picture for what resilience is from a research point of view and what we're looking at when we talk about resilience. So as you can see there in the middle of the screen, hopefully is just a snapshot of some of our young animals there when we're starting them on their immune competence testing journey. So there's a whole range of things that can impact on animals in their normal environments. We've got, as Mel mentioned, the seasonal variability. We've got husbandry practices that we do as part of the production process. There's things like social disruption when you're moving animals between mobs that they may not have been commingled before and all those sort of things. So there's lots of things that can impact on the animals. One or two aspects that we can try and get a handle on in terms of some measurements of resilience. We can actually control sometimes some of the pathogens that they're exposed to. And the use of vaccine is an example of that. And we use the vaccine response as part of looking at one of those aspects of resilience, that being their immunological response in terms of when they see these pathogens. So as you can see there, I've got a couple of boxes there highlighted. We're really just looking at some of the components of resilience as much as we can measure some of these things. I think that's where we have the unique ability on a research station to have a look in quite a lot of detail how the animals respond to some of these pathogens in the environment. So what we're looking at is just, as Mel mentioned, that resilience, which is the ability of the animal to thrive, basically, in these production environments, but also when they are challenged to return to that productive state relatively quickly as well. And as Mel mentioned, immune competence is one aspect of resilience. And just drilling quickly just a little bit further into that immune competence story. So we use the vaccine response, as I mentioned, to try and get a handle on how animals, the individual animals respond. As you can see, lots of people respond differently when we have vaccines and those sort of things too, and it's exactly the same for animals. And by using just a normal commercial clostridial vaccine, we know that we're getting a very good handle on how the animals respond. The key time we do this is when they're going through that stress of weaning, when they're being taken off their dams, they're mixed with other animals, they're potentially being exposed to other environmental pathogens they haven't seen before because they're moving between different paddocks and those sort of things. So a key component of the immune competence testing that we do is actually trying to put these animals in a controlled way under an amount of stress so that we can really pull apart those animals that cope well and respond well and the ones that don't do so well. And as I mentioned, there's two arms or two aspects of the immune response that we look at. That's the cell-mediated and the antibody-mediated immune response. And I think one of the things that's really important to appreciate with these as well, they're quite independent traits. They're not measuring the same thing. And when we have a look at the correlations between some of these traits, we know that they are operating independently. So that's why we've never gone down the path of advocating for looking at just cell-mediated or antibody-mediated immune responses. We really spent a lot of time bringing together the trait into the one phenotype, the ImmuneDEX phenotype, because we know there are competing priorities when an animal is mounting an immune response. And we're really trying to find these animals that mount an effective immune response to both arms when we're looking at that immune response. It's similar to something like fleece weight and fibre diameter. They're antagonistic relationships with some of these traits. So it was really important for us to make sure that we weren't selecting for one response that inadvertently made the animals more susceptible to other diseases. So I think hopefully that's given you just a bit more of an outline as to what this immune competence phenotype is and how we measure it, and why we think it's really important to have that, to look at that overall immune response.
And so, Amy, just to clarify, so we've got some questions coming about whether this ImmuneDEX trait will help with foot rot resistance, things like OJD, cheesy gland, pulpy kidney, pneumonia, all of those types of things.
A really great question. I guess one of the things that has been really encouraging that we've seen so far is that some of the correlations that we are seeing between ImmuneDEX and some of the other, what we call health traits, WEC, DAG, they are ones that we have absolutely looked at as part of this project. There are some really favourable correlations coming out there. They're not strong, we would call them favourable correlations. We haven't been able to drill down on some of those specific ones yet, but it is certainly a question we have front of mind when we're looking at more drilling down through some of these the other diseases and challenges we know the animals experience. We didn't have foot rot mentioned as part of this, but we certainly did any health intervention. We, with all of these animals, whether it was foot scald, an abscess or anything like that, anytime we basically had to intervene because we were concerned for the health of the animal, we have recorded it. And I think Brad has got some ideas too around some of the other traits, certainly respiratory illnesses and those sort of things. He's actually had some strong thoughts about where something like immune competence might have some relationships with that as well. If I could throw to Brad, if that's not, throw him under the bus.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. I guess in response to that question, to think that high ImmuneDEX animals will be resistant to every disease is not realistic. The likelihood that a high ImmuneDEX animal would be highly resistant to all of those diseases is unlikely. The aim of this trait is really that we would expect their general disease resistance to be better. So it's important to not confuse that with they'll be resistant to every disease. It's about their general ability to mount an immune response, and we expect to a majority of diseases that they would show an improved resistance, but we cannot guarantee that will translate to all animals. I guess a key part of the immune competence work to understand, and Amy's spoken nicely about the two different arms of the immune system. We know that if you select for resistance to a specific disease, that you can inadvertently increase susceptibility to another disease, especially if those diseases require very different arms of the immune system to control those pathogens. And we've seen that scenario in a lot of production animals. So what the immune competence trait is about is not selecting for resistance to a specific disease, it's about selecting for general disease resistance. And one thing we're looking at in Angus cattle at the moment is we certainly acknowledge that there are some really important economic diseases in cattle and sheep that we need to target specifically. And a good example in Angus cattle is BRD, bovine respiratory disease, pink eye. So what we're interested in doing is bringing the ImmuneDEX value, which is targeting general disease resistance, and combining that with selection for specific economically important diseases with the hope that we'll improve the resistance to those economically important diseases, but avoid the issue of selecting animals that are resistant to those diseases, but which may be susceptible to others.
Perfect, thank you. Aaron, did you have anything else to add to that one?
No, I think the team's covered it pretty well there, Mel. I think the main take-home message really is that we're not talking about sterile immunity here with this trait. Animals will still get sick, but what we're talking about is animals that have a capacity to resolve that disease. That they might get sick, but they'll get better. It won't knock them over, and that's very much the experience we've had in the cattle world. Is cattle that are low immune competence, they get sick, they maintain that disease in the herd, making others sick, and they die. And so that's a massive problem. So they're the animals that you want to eliminate out of your herd or flock. Thanks,
Aaron, for just backing that up. Just a couple of quick questions around the process. What is the process and cost for testing existing sires that already have a genomic result? And so what we can do here at Neogen is we can go back, because this test has been based around the Neogen GGP chip, we can actually go back to animals from March 2021 and run them through the pipeline to get an ImmuneDEX value for you. There is a small cost associated with that, but essentially that will come online around July when the results become available, and we'll have a on your submission form, you'll be able to select an ImmuneDEX upgrade and just pay a small fee just to re-extract those genotypes and run them through the pipeline to get ImmuneDEX values on any of those valuable sires that you might still be using within your flock. And also just on that, there are plans that Neogen will hand this technology over to Sheep Genetics in a couple of years' time, and then Sheep Genetics will incorporate it into their normal Merino Select runs and present that with all of your existing ASBVs. Not sure if it'll be included into an index, but I might just throw to our panel here a little bit, because there are some things that are going on within the cattle space in terms of how to incorporate ImmuneDEX into indexes. So I'm not sure, Brad, if you want to jump in there and maybe give an example about how Angus are using or wanting to incorporate ImmuneDEX into their indexes.
Yeah, no problems, Mel. I'm not sure if I can drive the slide deck or not, but if you could put up maybe the last slide in that deck for me.
Doing that for you now.
Fantastic. So yes, in the immune competence work initially started here in Australia, working with Angus Australia, and I guess we're a little bit further down the track than where we are with sheep, but sheep are quickly catching up thanks to the great work that Neogen's doing here. So already in the Angus world, if you like, we have ImmuneDEX values for any animals that have been genotyped. In our database, you can get ImmuneDEX values, and so it's still a research breeding value at this stage, so you can access that information, but why it's a research breeding value is we're still looking at different scenarios of how we might really start to select for that trait. A couple of ideas that we've been thinking about in a bull catalogue, for example, and you can see that picture there where we might for animals with an average or above average ImmuneDEX value provide effectively ImmuneDEX symbol or an ImmuneDEX tick to allow people to know that those animals are at least average for immune competence. You can see what it might look like there for that cow in a particular catalogue. We talked a lot through the process of developing this trait about whether we aim to breed for the highest ImmuneDEX animals or effectively remove the lower ImmuneDEX animals. And I see Hamish has got a question there in the chat around that. And the answer is whichever way you do it, you improve the population mean and ImmuneDEX trait within your herd is improving. I guess why we think about removing the bottom animals is a lot of our data from the research we've done out in production environments tells us that animals with an average or above average ImmuneDEX value tend to be absolutely fine. It's really those low immune competence animals that are being problematic in our systems. And that's regardless of whether you think about it in terms of actual disease or response to vaccination. You know, those animals are those low responders where you might be vaccinating animals in your herd or your flock, but there are some non-responders, and there always is. And it's about trying to get those animals out of the system. Anyway, so that's an idea with ImmuneDEX where we might be able to put that in a catalogue to show that animals are average or above average. The other one we're thinking about within the Angus breed is incorporating resilience traits into some of our breeding indexes. You can see there our most commonly used index, the Angus breeding index, where we target lots of traits, growth, calving ease, fertility, looking at the potential to add in resilience traits. And the objective here is we obviously will never go out and advocate to stop selecting for production traits because they're super important. We all know that, and we all acknowledge that. This work is about trying to minimise the impact of targeted selection on production impacts on the ability of those animals to cope in the environment. So what we're promoting is to incorporate resilience traits with your production traits and all those other economically important traits to try and drag the resilience of your animals along with those other traits. So just as a component of that. Things we're thinking about at Angus Australia are combining, as Amy mentioned earlier, immune competence is really only one component of resilience. There's a lot of different things that contribute to how resilient an animal is, how well they cope with those environmental challenges. In the Angus world, we're looking at traits around heat tolerance. We're looking at, for example, how coat type might interact with heat tolerance. Things like temperament we know are really important and are linked very closely with some of these resilience phenotypes. But what we're aiming to do is to go down the track of actually developing a resilience index that might be tailored to different production environments, where if you think about Angus cattle in the north, obviously disease resistance regarding external parasites, etc., are really important. Obviously their heat tolerance really important. As you come into different environments, bringing different resilience traits, stress, ability to cope with stress and different traits like that into indexes. So that's just a little snapshot of where we're looking to go with these ImmuneDEX values in Angus. And it's about bringing them together with those other really important resilience traits to really identify those animals that are truly production.
Perfect. Amy, did you want to add anything there?
Yes, please. So just building on what Brad mentioned too, what we've actually been able to see with some of the work we've done to date is that, and I think there was a question too about what does this, will this trait help with other diseases or aspects of disease? I think the question seemed to be around some of those clostridial vaccines. So what we have seen quite clearly with some of so we also measured some of these animals for their response to Barbavax. So it was quite clear that animals that mount an effective immune response to the clostridial vaccine also mount an effective immune response to Barbavax. And that's just one example of where the vaccine response measurement that we're doing does give us a better handle on how the animals respond to some of these other challenges as well. And as Brad mentioned, identifying those animals that respond well to a vaccine is an important part of this phenotype that we've been able to measure and can see some clear indications that animals that respond well to some vaccines tend to respond well to some of the other vaccines as well. So I think that's an important part of this ImmuneDEX story as well.
Mel, I'd just like to add just one point there, just to make producers really aware that this ImmuneDEX trait is not about getting to a point where we don't need to vaccinate anymore. This is about making those vaccines work better for us. So the ImmuneDEX trait was never developed as a means, as a strategy that would lead to a point where we no longer vaccinate animals. We very much encourage people to continue vaccinating animals through their normal vaccination protocols. What we're hoping to achieve through this use of this trait is that those animals that are vaccinated will respond better to those vaccinations, and we will get fewer non-responders to those vaccines that are those problematic animals that can cause you losses down the track.
Perfect. Thank you. Really important point there, Brad. It's much appreciated. So maybe, Aaron, if you could jump in here, what are we actually seeing in terms of variation in cattle for immune competence, both within breed and maybe also between different breeds as well?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. What's clear from the cattle result is that we haven't even been inadvertently selecting for immune competence. So there are a lot of general concepts out there that, selecting for survival as much as anything, but also things like some of the productivity traits, fatness, things like that, are selecting for animals that are resilient. And there's limited truth to support that, because when we actually specifically measure the immune competence trait or the ImmuneDEX trait and look at that across herds or across breeds, we don't see a very small distribution. We see a very large distribution, suggesting that there hasn't been any selective pressure for the trait. So the image that I brought up here, so each of the columns are individuals within a herd, and that's their immune competence score plotted up on the vertical axis there. And so you can see across all of the different herds we've done over a long period of time that we see a huge distribution of immune competence values within those populations of animals. So, and that carries across for things like the cell response and the antibody response. You can see for the top results there, so for the 2012 results, I also put in the live weight results. So that's something that we have pushed for pretty hard. And you can see within populations, you get a much more defined structure around the middle of the distribution there. Whereas for immune competence, they're all very spread out, suggesting there hasn't been any selective pressure there. So that's for animals within a herd, and obviously more often than not within a specific breed. If we compare it across breeds, what we see are basically overlapping distributions of performance. So basically high immune competence over to the right of the screen, low immune competence to the left, and the bulk of the population sitting sort of in the middle of the distribution there. And so this has been done for breeds like Angus, Brahman, Charolais, Hereford, Shorthorns, and Wagyu are shown here. They all overlap each other. And so I guess we hear a lot of anecdotal stories about this breed's better than that breed and this did better than that. What we know is that there's good and bad in every breed. And that, I imagine, will translate across to the breeds in the sheep population. So we've predominantly measured merinos to date. Amy probably has a bit more familiarity around other other breeds that we might have looked at, but I imagine we'll see exactly the same result, that you get good and bad in every breed, with the majority of animals sitting in the middle. What we don't want are curves moving towards the left-hand side where the majority of the population are down that bottom end. So we want to make sure that we maintain the animal population where it is at the moment, because if the animal has a natural ability to fight disease through its immune system, it reduces the number of therapeutic interventions that we have to do. So not so much in terms of vaccination, But in terms of putting antibiotics into the system, putting drenches into the system, putting parasiticides and those sort of things into the system, and because we look after our animals so well, we've probably masked some of these sort of immune competence duds through the system. Basically, we really look after these animals and we bring them through. But unfortunately, that means that they keep passing those bad genes on to the next generation. And if we're trying to reduce the amount of therapeutic intervention, we need to reduce the incidence of those duds within our herd or flock. And that's very much what we see this trade as about, is providing producers with a tool that allows them to identify animals in that bottom end, which hopefully over time, ensures that we have to use the minimal number of therapeutic interventions going forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. So just a reminder, any more questions, pop them into that Q&A box down the bottom in the middle. And I will also, as we start to near the end of this webinar, if you could select on the survey button and start filling out some of those questions for us, that would be great as well. Amy, we've got another question here. There are some common assumptions in the industry, like selecting for growth or fat improves resilience, or that selecting for wool reduces it. Based on the data, are any of those assumptions correct?
Yeah, thanks, Mel. One thing that was really important to us right from the start of doing a lot of this work was to measure as many traits as possible, because we recognise that immune competence, it's a relatively hard trait to measure. So we were really keen to measure as many other production and health parameters as we could, and really have a look at those correlations. Some of the initial work indicated that there could be some unfavourable relationships, and certainly what we had seen in the cattle story, and particularly in North America, there was a great challenge with health in the dairy industry. When those animals have been pushed really hard for production, some of those animals actually ended up collapsing, and they couldn't deal with their production environment. So we were really keen to try as hard as possible to collect a lot of information to really get a strong handle on what some of these correlations may be. And I appreciate, certainly when you're looking at a mob of animals, you can usually pick out the good doers, the poor doers, and all those sort of things, and it is natural to assume some would be more resilient than others. So with that in mind, as I mentioned, we collected all this information, and what was really interesting to us was that there weren't strong negative relationships, it seems. There is not one or two traits that were absolutely able to tell us which animals were more resilient or were not. And I'll just quickly put up a graphic there of the actual correlations, the genetic correlations that we have been able to estimate so far. There's some clear favourable relationships, and I think our resident geneticist, Tony Roberta, would say our WEC and DAG relationships, they're favourable, but they're actually approaching significance. The value is only minus 0.1. So what that means is the more immune competent an animal is, the lower their WEC measurement was, and the lower their DAG measurement was as well. So they're key favourable relationships. But what we don't see are really strong favourable relationships with some of the other traits, such as the weaning weights, fleece weight, and fibre diameter. We're calling them basically neutral relationships. So I guess that's also a good news story, because we know that what we're seeing in these animals, we're not inadvertently selecting for animals that are not resilient. What this information is telling us is that you're best to select for the actual trait itself. There are some antagonistic relationships, we know that, but I think part of a good program, a good breeding design, is to identify the traits that are important to you and focusing on those and using an index where possible to ensure you're putting adequate amounts of pressure on the individual traits that you're interested in.
I think that's really important as well. The ImmuneDEX is another breeding tool in the toolbox for resilience, but it's not there to replace WEC or DAG. We need to continue to keep those in our breeding objectives, but this ImmuneDEX is just another tool that we can add to help select those more desirable animals.
Completely agree. Yep.
In the cattle space, obviously, they don't see this story the same. There is a few unfavourable relationships with production traits in the cattle space. Aaron, Brad, have you got any comments on that and why our sheep population might be slightly different?
I'm happy to have an initial go at that one. Yeah, so we do see in Angus cattle, we definitely see, Mel, you might be able to bring up that slide 28 for me if you could. So in Angus cattle, we do see negative genetic correlations with some of our growth traits. So you can see in the box on the right-hand side of the slide there, that's weaning weight and yearling weight have a negative genetic correlation with ImmuneDEX. The good news is that although it's negative, it's not particularly strong. So there are animals that are both good for growth and good for immune competence. I guess the message here is that as we select hard for productivity, and the graph there shows you, if you look at the red line, that is the genetic progress for the weaning weight trait. So that's percentage change in the breed average EBVs for weaning weight over time. And the blue line is for our ImmuneDEX trait. Now, arguably the ImmuneDEX trait, the dots are all over the place, so it is very hard to draw a true line that represents the trend. But I think the data is telling us that generally, as we've driven for productivity with our selection, that we are starting to impact on some of those resilience traits like ImmuneDEX. Why it might be different in sheep is a little bit hard to know, obviously, but potentially we have been putting more selection pressure on health traits via WEC and other traits in the sheep industry over time, whereas for Angus cattle, this is really the first health-related trait that we've had data on that we can use to select animals. So maybe, and it's anecdotal, of course, is part of the answer to that question might be that we have inadvertently been selecting, dragging productivity and health traits along together to a better extent in the sheep industry relative to cattle industry, and that's largely driven by the access to tools to target that trait. So certainly in Angus cattle, the ImmuneDEX trait is the first time that we have had a health-based trait for selection for the breed, whereas those other health traits in sheep that have been around for a long time and people have done a very, very good job at selecting animals for those improvements in those health traits. So that's potentially part of the answer to why we might be seeing somewhat different scenarios between the breeds, Mel.
Perfect. Aaron or Amy, got any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, Mel. So as Brad said, I mean, the key take-home message here is there's no reason why you can't have both. So you can have high productivity, you can have immune competence. If the correlation was -1, we'd be deeply concerned, but the correlation is lowly unfavourable in cattle and almost zero in the sheep. So it means that you can select for both, but you do actually have to actively make that decision. One won't bring the other along, so you have to choose to select for both parts of it. Yeah, I think that's the key message from me.
Perfect. Thanks, Aaron. So just another question here. Are there plans or interest to measure this in maternal composites? The answer is absolutely. The response that we've had to this trait just in merinos has been incredible. And obviously we have both our maternal and our terminal populations that are both very interested in this as well. And so we are making active steps to plan out how we can start measuring phenotypes in our maternal and terminal breeds and bring them along for the journey as well. So that's a definite yes to that question. So what we might do is to start wrapping up here. Remember that survey down the side. We'd be very grateful if you would fill that out. But I might just go to each of our panellists and just ask that, given everything we've discussed today, you know, what's the most important way that studs should start using ImmuneDEX in their breeding programs?
So I'll go first, if you like. I guess the key for me with all of this is that we know producers work hard. We don't want to ask them to work any harder. So I think this is where it's been so great to have Neogen as part of this journey, is that the tool is there now available to use without having to do any additional work. Hopefully we've done a lot of the hard work to really understand the trait and to bring it into, and as we've said before, it's a tool in the toolbox. Without having to do any additional work, if you're already submitting samples and those sort of things, it is something that hopefully producers can see the benefit of without having to do any extra work to incorporate something like ImmuneDEX into their breeding programs. It's bringing along a lot of favourable traits, the correlations we know with what we've seen, and it's not taking away a lot of pressure that are on the other production traits as well. So for me, that was, you know, one of the beauties of this collaboration is, here is the phenotype, here we can bring it to industry. It's available to use.
Thanks, Amy. Brad or Aaron, have you got any closing comments?
I guess I'll just to reiterate what Amy said, Mel. To me, it's all about that balanced selection. So if moving forward we can maintain the resilience of our animals while continuing to drive for those increases in productivity, I think that's a big win for the industry. And certainly for Angus, that's what we are aiming to do. If we can hold resilience at level, the resilience of our animals, even hold that where it is now while we continue to drive for productivity, I think that's a big winner. So for me, it's all about that balanced approach to your genetic selection of animals.
Beautiful. Aaron, anything to add to that?
Yeah, for me, it's all about the awareness of the trait and obviously the importance of maintaining an immune system, a functional immune system in our animals, unless we want to be responsible for therapeutically bringing them through the system. We need the animals to look after themselves. And I think there's an increasing expectation that we maintain animals that way. And like all these things, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And what we've provided here is a tool that allows people to measure it and improve, or at least maintain the trait at existing levels within the animal populations that we look after.
Thank you. It's really been very clear from today that there's, you know, some major costs that sit with disease and a relatively small number of animals that might be driving a lot of that cost. And now we have the opportunity with that ImmuneDEX tool to actually identify those animals and do something about it. So just to wrap up, finally, I just want to say a really big thank you to all of our project contributors for getting ImmuneDEX to market. MLA Donor Company for helping to co-fund this project, along with CSIRO for conducting the valuable research, and Sheep Genetics and AgBoo for providing guidance and a pathway to eventually integrate ImmuneDEX into ASBBs in the future. And as I said before, Neogen's really proud to work with all of these organisations and be the link that can actually deliver important research to market sooner rather than later. So thank you all for your time today. If you have any other follow-up questions, please reach out to us here at Neogen and we can answer those questions for you. But thank you to our panellists, Amy, Aaron and Brad. Really appreciate your time today and the contribution that you've given us and all of the hard work into developing that reference population so we can use ImmuneDEX in merinos. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mel.